Well, I will introduce this panel then. Okay, so welcome to this panel titled "Lost in Work: Escaping Capitalism" on Amelia Horgan's new book. So panelists are Amelia Horgan here, and Amelia Horgan is a writer from London. She's currently completing doctoral research on work at the University of Essex's School on Philosophy and Art History, where she's also an assistant lecturer. Her first book, the book we'll be discussing, Lost in Work: Escaping Capitalism, came out this year with Pluto Press. And we also have as panelists Maro Pantazidou and Valeria Pulignano. Maro Pantazidou is an educator, facilitator, and researcher interested in the redistribution of time and work and how this links to bigger social and ecological transformations. She's currently studying for her PhD with the University of York. She's also enjoying running participatory workshops on the future of work with activists, students, and artists. Previously, she served as the Deputy Director for Global Strategy and Impact with Amnesty International. She's collaborated with several universities and civil society networks on projects seeking to unpack how social change happens. And then we have Valeria Pulignano, who is a professor in sociology, expertise employment, industrial relations, and labour markets in a comparative EU perspective, at the Centre for Sociological Research at KU Leuven. She's published extensively on topics related to the sociology of work, comparative European industrial relations, democracy at work, precarious work, labour markets and inequality, working conditions, job quality, and workers' voice. She serves as principal coordinator of the RN17 on work, employment, and industrial relations within the European Sociological Association, and she's co-researcher at CRIMT, Centre for Globalisation and Work, at the University of Montreal and Laval in Canada. She's PI of Respect Me, an ERC advanced grant on resolving precariousness, advancing the theory and measurement of precariousness across the paid-unpaid work continuum. Okay, so we are going to have first about 10 minutes of talk from Amelia, and then we're going to hear from our other panelists, with loads of time left in this session for discussion and comments. So afterwards, you can put your questions in the Q&A box at the side, and we'll see them, or just put them in the chat, and I think you can raise your hand as well, and we'll find a way of getting to you, and I can either read them out or we'll talk. But we're going to start with Amelia Horgan. So Amelia, if you'd like to go ahead.
Thank you so much, Orlando, and thanks also to all of the organizers. I haven't been able to go to like that many events so far, but it's really a really fantastic set of events over 3 whole days, which is great, and I'm learning a lot. So I'm going to talk, hopefully not for that long, about the book and the kind of ideas motivating it, and my research, and some thoughts about writing a kind of book like this, a book about work for a general audience. Yeah, and then I'm really interested to hear what others have thought about it. So I first came to think about the problem of work in terms of power in the firm in a kind of strangely roundabout way, which was that one of my first jobs was working as a policy officer for a housing association, which I thought would mainly just be like writing nice briefings and writing some policies and it being a kind of socially conscious-ish job as these things go. But midway through that post, the organization I worked for ended up merging with another housing association, or was kind of taken over, gobbled up by one, which meant that all of our policies and all of our internal processes had to become aligned with theirs, and their standards of pay, the amount of work people expected to do were very different. So I got to see the kind of inner process of that intensification of work and how a firm makes itself, I guess, more competitive internally and what that looked like. And that's where I thought, okay, there are very serious power relations going on here, and they present themselves in all kind of ideological ways, and there are all kinds of stories told about efficiency and customer service. And I found that really fascinating. So I wanted to study that, I guess, and look at it, how it had been treated within political philosophy. When I started the PhD, there wasn't that much being said about work, but I started the PhD in 2017, and now there is quite a lot being said about work. at the same time, there's been a kind of rise of a popular discourse about productivity and self-care and well-being, as well as activist and kind of policy focuses on things like UBI and shorter working weeks. So it's a lot in the air. And there was also at the same time as this kind of popular discussion of productivity and well-being, two aspects. One of which was the way in which this was kind of captured by firms and used to make people feel responsible for their own kind of management, their own looking after themselves. But there was also the way that this fed into, I guess, a nascent left populism, particularly in Britain, and a lot of young people having a real sense of frustration and anger at a system that they kind of named as capitalism. But one thing I wanted to do with the book is say, okay, what is this thing, capitalism? What are its dynamics? How does it work at the level of the firm? And what does that mean for people's sense of self? There was a lot of kind of frustration at work, but I wanted to kind of dig deeper into what exactly is bad about work. So these two recent trends towards thinking about work. Within political philosophy, I think one thing that's lacking is a sense of, and I always sound like a kind of, I guess like a bit of like an old trot when I say this, but a sense of class struggle, right? There's a sense of who are the agents when work is discussed in political philosophy, and it tends to be policymakers and it tends to be managers in firms. But so that's one thing I wanted to inject into the book. And there's a similar kind of problem with the, I guess, popular magazine and also kind of left populist discussion of work is that there was a focus on individuals, and it tends towards the subjective experience of work. So as much as I wanted to talk about the subjective experience, I didn't want to write something which was overly focused on that. So yeah, kind of moving beyond that kind of lack of a subject and thinking about, you know, what happens at work. So the book addresses three main questions. The first is, what is work? Which is one of those things which obviously seems straightforward, but is actually really congested. And hopefully we can discuss that a bit more. The second thing is, what, if anything, is bad about work? That was the second question. And the third is, what do we do? So this is not, none of these are easy questions. I set myself up for a difficult set of things to ask. So in the book, I argue for an expanded definition of work, not merely wage labor, but one in which we don't lose sight of some kind of fundamental features. So we might not want to describe everything under the sun as work, but we might think about the ways in which more and more things become like this activity work. I talk about the problem, this kind of extension of work to new categories, work creep, including things like emotional labor. And then I think about what is so bad about work. I've got a long list here. So there's domination, sense of meaninglessness, alienation, exploitation, the subjectification, as in the kind of subjects being produced at work that might be detrimental to individuals and to society. So relatedly, negative effects on the democratic or egalitarian character of society at large, physical and psychological stress at the level of the whole world, overproduction, in between relationally, kind of cruel interdependencies, which are presented as kind of joy of teamwork, but actually provide kind of stressful competition, interpersonal strife across asymmetries of power, and a lack of control or autonomy. So there's more as well, but I'm going to stop there. Another thing I want to really talk about in the book is how these problems are exacerbated and by deepening inequality and a really bifurcated job market. Obviously, we've got a situation in Britain where, at the moment, where there are labour shortages in particular bits of the economy, but overall there is still an under demand for labour, which means people are less able to get the hours of work they need, and the hours of work people are given act as an axis of control for employers. Yeah, I wanted to avoid just saying that work is merely kind of effort or obligation, but pointing to the ways in which contemporary decommodification of work, while that decommodification can be is a really important goal, especially along the terrains of social reproduction, there are ways in which work is being decommodified and made not wage labor presently, which are troubling. So things like workfare schemes, in which the decommodification presents itself as people being expelled from labour markets and forced to work for free. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to do that much connecting with decommodification, but I know that Maro has got some thoughts on that. So yes, I've not been thematic enough. So what's the solution? I try and argue for not one clear fixed path, but the need for experimenting, but with the condition on that none of these experiments count for very much unless you deepen the power of trade unions and working class movements. So it's all good to say we need to come up with some great policies and get places to adopt them, but we need agents who will kind of force the hands of employers, of capital owners, for that to scale and for that to be fixed and meaningful and not kind of backslide. So things like UBI have a place but can't act as silver bullets, but you kind of have like a kind of it's not a kind of menu of reforms, but it's thinking about how do those reforms allow other reforms to happen, and how do those reforms point to a bigger transformation in the end. One thing I particularly talk about is communalizing or socializing aspects of social reproduction, and the importance of politicizing the question of time. So as well as reducing working hours, thinking about control over time and the rise of 0-hour contracts, the rise of people not knowing how much time they will be working the next week as an important avenue of struggle. As well as kind of more pedestrian, but perhaps as politicizing issues like the right to switch off. And yeah, so I think the debate around what the solution to the problems of work is often quite moralized and needlessly polarized. So you have on the one hand people saying it must be UBI, and the other hand people saying no, it cannot be UBI, we have to just rebuild trade union identity. But I argue for a kind of yes and approach, and say that it's going to be an extremely hard battle, because there's the reasons that work are structured in the way that it is, and the way that are harmful are because those are the ways to accumulate capital, to accumulate profit, right, to create value. It's not by accident that these things have happened. It's not going to be a case of politely convincing. So rebuilding power is going to take a long time, and there are needs to think about new avenues and new ways of politicizing struggles and joining up to social movements that will help us denaturalize work and rebuild working class power. Yeah, I think that's all for me for now. I'm excited to hear what others have to say.
Well, thank you, Amelia. I think that's certainly a lot to talk about when we get to the comments as well. Maro and Valeria, would either of you like to go next? Or do you not mind? No? Okay, well, Maro, you're on the left of my screen, so please go ahead.
Sure. Have I unmuted successfully? Can you hear me? Great. Okay, so yeah, hi from me as well. I think, Amelia, you've already explained why work is not working, and you do that so well in the book. So I think from my side, and in line with today's theme of decommodifying work and building on your work as much as I can, I thought of turning our attention to decommodifying time, which you mentioned at the end now of your intervention. And time is somehow, for me, the magical key in undoing the commodification of work. And obviously, decommodifying time could be no easy feat. Like, the way we use time and the way we exist in it is hard to grasp, it's hard to get hold of, because everything we do, everything we say, everything we try to become, in this case, decommodified subjects, I guess, we do it in time. And as Barbara Adam, the sociologist of time, says, it's almost like this under-theorized backdrop, to all of our social life. And what I have found in my work and the research I'm trying to do in my PhD is that it really takes quite some reflection and effort to better not just understand, but digest and own the ways that time is commodified and the ways this is entangled with inequalities in all the ways we live our lives. So if I could, in a few minutes, touch briefly on a couple of these points, I guess the first, the most well understood commodification of time is the one in quantitative terms, right? Like that we need to sell our time to make a living, by selling our hours, right? And this is the cornerstone of the institution of waged work. But really, it's rooted in the idea that our labor power can be extracted into these bounded, measurable slots, right? And that idea that work can and should be sold and bought in these rigid time intervals would have probably been quite absurd to some of our predecessors, right, a few centuries ago. And I think, Amelia, if I remember correctly, I think in your book, I really like where at some point you mentioned how certain lived experiences of work would resonate with people laboring across centuries, right? Like the experience of feeling unsafe at work or violence. But I think that experience of like managing my time in this rigid bit, be it a 9-to-5 shift or a 2 hours meeting where we have to solve a very complex issue that everybody knows cannot be solved in 2 hours, was never that naturalized as it is today. And actually, Amelia and I are part of this like working group of women that focus on and read on work. And right now we're rereading David Graeber's famous book on bullshit jobs. And I just read last week how he mentions and uses this really good example of how maybe in ancient times when a rich individual would want some pottery, right, they could think of buying the pottery or buying the potter, you know, in form of slavery, but not of actually extracting their labor power into slots and intervals, right? So I think that part, that getting a life is about getting a job, and getting a job is about somebody buying your time, is something we're all familiar with. And I think, Amelia, again, in your book, in many ways, some more subtle than others, you speak about that vicious cycle between the commodification of work and time. Like the more we have to be in wage labor to be able to survive and consume, the less time is available to actually create an experiment, as you said, with other approaches to living and producing together. And then actually other valorizations and experiences of time, which I think then goes to the second point of the commodification of time, which is a more qualitative commodification of how time is imbued with meaning. And again, it's much debated in the whole post-industrial work ethic conversation that we already now own the means of production because that's ourselves, right? And then every moment is a moment of work, and Amelia speaks of the jobification of life. So then getting a life is not only about getting a job and selling your time, but about meaningfully managing that time. And that is the theme of continuous self-improvement. And I think in the book it's called even a cult, right, of continuous self-improvement. And then in that sense, if all our capacities, if everything is put to work, all our time is put to work, right? It's like the total mobilization of time. And we see that rise in productivity hacks, but also, I think even more importantly, we see this rise in a sense of temporal suffering, which I see a lot in the workshops I do with all kinds of workers and artists, that sense of fragmentation of time. And for me, the last point maybe to make, which for me is also the most important one, is that both this quantitative and the qualitative commodification of time perpetuate this myth, like this key cultural fixation that time is a resource that one can own, can manage, can conquer in a very individual crusade. And the same way that the myth of meritocracy that again Amelia has talked about masks intersectional inequalities, I think that myth of the individually conquered time masks how time itself is a product of power relations, right? So who has or has not time, who can speed up or slow down, who can afford to wait. All these experiences of time are mediated by power. And actually, I feel a lot of the rise in platform economy, which we mainly discuss as a further deregulation of work and a transformation of the world of work, is very much about like a massive time maintenance enterprise, like literally a fleet of people who, literally a fleet sometimes on motorbikes, who bring foods or, you know, electronic gadgets or on-demand childcare to other people who need to maintain their temporal routines and their schedules and whose time is worth more. And I think Sarah Sarma, cultural theorist and time, talks about these time architectures, right? Where some people's temporal demands create temporal vulnerabilities for others. So what I'm trying to say, I guess, here is that we need to train our eyes to see these inequalities in terms of time, if we are to see time more as a collective endeavor. And maybe to wrap up, and we can talk more about it, because I think Amelia always challenges us to think and talk about solutions as well, as you did. Like, we're locked in these sensibilities of time that perpetuate the commodification of work. And the thing is, how do we liberate time then? And some of the examples given in the book are about like wasting or squandering time, like slacking as a means of resistance. And I guess that's more the escaping part of capitalism, right? If we think about taming, eroding capitalism, and the other things Eric Collier, right, talks about, what other solutions do we have to liberate time? And then again, obviously, there's all the talk, Amelia mentioned it, around reducing working weeks, universal basic income, so reducing, redistributing time, and breaking this vicious cycle, right, where we don't have time to invent new ways of living and working together. But what I'm most interested in, and I'm really just trying to explore this, is what would it mean to share time, right, to democratize it? And there have been various examples. I am in Greece, and there have been various experimentation with time banks, with other ways of exchanging or collectivizing care, as Amelia mentioned. But I feel like that question of how can we reckon time differently and share it differently is at the key of also rethinking work and what work means. So I'd be keen to discuss this more. And I hope I didn't speak for too long.
No, that is perfect, right on time. In fact, thank you very much. Okay, so our third panelist, Valeria Pulignano. Valeria, if you'd like to take it away.
Yeah, thank you very much, Orlando, and thank you also for the organizers to organize this session around this fantastic book. And let me congratulate to Amelia and to say thanks, Amelia, for writing this book. I think it's a great book. Is a really kind of really realistic, truly story about what makes people vulnerable and precarious, and as you said, exploited and so forth. And going back to the point that Maro was making about what is this about? Is about how capitalism functions, and it reminds me the work of Rosa about the life behind growth. So probably we need to rethink about new ways about how do we grow, what kind of is important for considering as being at the core of growth. Well, I think it is here, particularly regarding capitalism, that I want to make some comments. What I learned from the fantastic book of Amelia. First of all, I loved the kind of very historical approach you take. From industrialization till today, with financialization, internationalization, globalization, whatever you want to call it. And indeed, my kind of a key message I take from the book Lost in Work is this idea of the hegemonic image of a capitalist system of exploitation, precariousness, which is in fact, to me, eating more and more at the kind of social bones, and particularly, the most important social resources that we have available. This is what actually I take as a message, a key message from the book, which is in fact labor power. And there, really, so therefore the need to escape, to create collective action around that, to escape from it by labor, but also perhaps by capitalism itself. And I want to kind of elaborate a bit more on this, because your book, Amelia, made me thinking about what, in the sociology and political economy much more widely, people have been discussing since a couple of, decades ago, around, the kind of end of capitalism or whatsoever. I remember myself the book of Wolfgang Streeck, particularly from a political economy perspective, writing about, how capitalism will end, expressing this idea of a failing system, where he presented the argument that the marriage between democracy and capitalism is ill-suited partners brought together in the shadow of World War II was coming to an end. But suddenly, his book and his argument has been also, raising a lot of debates around this ending of capitalism. Another interesting book which contributed to that was the book of Paul Collier on the future of capitalism, where he was presenting something completely, opposite, where in fact he was arguing on the fact that capitalism will not be abolished, but a better system will replace it. And perhaps this is, what we see nowadays going more and more. And directly related to these, there was another interesting, very interesting contribution made by Colin Crouch at the time, writing about the strange not death of neoliberalism in the light of the 27-28 financial crisis. Now, Colin Crouch in his book particularly argued that capitalism will kind of shrug off the challenge that Streck was pointing to. And in fact, he said that the reason for that is the fact that neoliberal capitalism seems to be about free markets, but in practice it is concerned, in fact, with this dominance regime, hegemonic regime, a dominance over public life. And this is where I want to end. Now, sorry to make this excursion about Streck and Collier and Crouch, but I think when I was reading your book, Amelia, really brought me back to this debate, because in fact I really do think that Lost in Work does remarkably well explain where do we stand today, in the sense that in fact shows this kind of dominance, as I said before, of the way how we are experiencing capitalism today. You pose the question, why does work make so many people miserable? And this is the key question, I think. Now, if I go back again to classical sociologists, Marx, Weber, Durkheim, well, all the sociological thoughts tell us that, at a certain point, there has been always an order, social order created around, or perhaps the other way around, which kept things in a kind of stability. But nevertheless, there was a social order created around exploitation, as Marx says, alienation, that you also recall very well in your book. There was social cleavages, as Weber says. There was also the division of labor. So a lot of things which was in fact bringing into aspect of inequality and power, as you just mentioned. But I really do think that what is interesting in reading your book, really very new, is the fact that in your book you show that in fact this kind of jobification of daily life, this unpaid labor of a housework, the rise of 0 hours contract, so all these shows that there is a kind of issue here which is basically explaining us why in fact there was and there is perhaps not anymore that kind of social compromises which was indicating in the work of Streck and Colin Crouch, putting at the basic of what they were talking about, the end or not end of capitalism. And I think that the question is then, okay, so what is there? And you pointed quite well, saying that it is nothing to do about having good or bad jobs, although jobs we have out there are quite bad. It's also not an issue of the society that is not giving jobs to people, but the question we need to pose ourselves in order to answer to all these is completely different, is whether in fact these jobs are fulfilling for people, are giving something really to people, and are making in fact people, yes or not, kind of miserable. So I was reflecting myself also, what does this bring analytically? And I think it brings the kind of struggles which in fact people do around capitalism, and the way in which in fact capitalism on the other side uses this struggle to reconfigure itself. Now, what I want to say here, and I recall very much here also the work done by Rosa. I mean, in other words, in the past, people struggles were around competition, recognition, legitimacy, and were determined, in fact, by the level each individual could reach in society in one way or another. Now, what we experience now as ourselves, and probably this is what makes people miserable in the story that you mentioned in the book, is the fact people don't have the certainty that even though they have a position in society, they can reach that kind of things that previously perhaps they were be able to reach. So this kind of uncertainty, this kind of anxiety that people they have, which creates a lot of insecurity, a lot of precariousness whatsoever, or precarity, and which makes in fact people miserable. So the work which is done doesn't pay off people. And there, in fact, is I mean, at least I found it a quite interesting key aspect of your book, and perhaps is in the light of that I don't know whether it's possible. I would like to really pose a question for you, but also perhaps also for opening the debate. I would like to know a bit more about what are the implications that you might envisage that all this kind of situation might open in terms of in fact and new chances for future growth. So how do we move in terms of rethinking? How do we grow in our society? How do we reconfigure it? Because it's there that we need to really perhaps rethink also in terms of rebuilding a collective. Now Maro was reflecting about that dimension of time is very important, and I think it links also with that, and also the reproduction of social inequality at the intersection between work and life, home and work. And I also do hope that I haven't taken so much time. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. Three brilliant ways to start this discussion, I think. And I think, well, Valeria, you've given us a very good way to start it. Amelia, do you want to start by saying anything about that while people think of comments to put in the chat or put your hands up? Well, there's a little Q&A thing as well, which isn't quite the chat box. So you'll see it, two things to the right of it. But in the meantime, Amelia, do you want to respond on that point?
Sure, yeah. Thank you both for such thoughtful comments on the book. It's it's really wonderful to see it engaged with. On the question you asked, Valeria, I think in terms of new avenues for politicization it opens up, I think time is such an important one, and I think what Maro said really points to that, and I think it's a way of uniting across a really bifurcated labor market, different kinds of struggle, because on the one hand you have struggles in, I guess, salaried work over people do have a degree of autonomy over reducing working time, but then you have joining that up with I guess towards the bottom of the labor market where people have very precarious work. They might not even have too much work. They might have too little work, or completely unreliable, unpredictable times. So I think that control of time is a good way of uniting an atomized and bifurcated labor force. I think one of the things I don't have a good grip on, and I'd be really interested to hear what everyone else thinks, is how we bring these questions of transformation and growth and control into view of issues around the climate crisis. I mean, I have, of course, the strong sense, which I'm sure we all share, that this crisis is fundamentally connected to capitalism. It's fundamentally connected to the ways in which capitalism causes overproduction, relies on and grew out of fossil fuel consumption. But it's something that I thought more about the kind of experience of work side of it rather than the kind of ecological crisis. And the answer I kind of come to with it is something like a truly transformational Green New Deal, with a just transition, with jobs, with workers' conditions in those fossil fuel sectors kind of protected, or not protected, but like guarantee of equivalent skilled unionized work. But I also have the underlying feeling that this is something of a fudge, right? This is one of these things which would be fantastic to have, and we should fight for. But it's one of those areas where I would really like to hear what others think, especially in relation to the detail of the kind of the ecological crisis, the climate crisis, and the political economy of that. Yeah.
Thank you. Maro, do you have anything to say about that before we open it up to the floor?
I just wanted to comment that although we hadn't planned this, it was quite interesting how, like we've touched like the big things. I think Amelia gave this overview of what's wrong with work. And then we spoke about like, okay, what's wrong with commodifying time? And then I think Valeria gave us this super useful story of capitalism and where it's at now systemically, not to go back to that question of including like environmental collapse. So I think just to build on the point about climate, and I feel like that question of the return of the time question is very, very alive, including for that reason, right? Like that reason of like end times. So it's like the question is very pertinent ecologically, politically, socially. And I agree with Amelia that, and that's why I'm focusing much of my work on time. There's a common experience of either lack of time, although lived in very different ways, or lack of control, or fragmentation, or sense of uncertainty, or a sense of lost future that spans across different experiences, right? And how we respond to this and how we unite people around this, I think some of the discussions around universal basic income are trying to do that. But one thing that maybe it's interesting to throw into the mix is that you might remember that in the beginning of the pandemic, there was a global campaign on a care income. I don't know if either of you remember this, which was somehow building also on the wages for housework campaigns of the 70s. And then the idea of having a care income was not only connected with care as discussed in social reproduction feminist theory, but in the broader care for others and for the environment, like for land. And I guess that goes back to that same question of commodification, right? Like would giving a care income as a way of changing and incentivize how we spend our time in caring for others, for our communities, and for the environment be a way to further commodify work and time? Or is it actually an intermediate solution to be able to transition in a different model of growth or degrowth or post-growth, as Valeria mentioned? I guess there are no easy answers, obviously, there, right?
This leads quite well into the first question we have in the Q&A, actually, Maro. So you were talking about these universalizing campaigns or programs or ideas for campaigns or programs, right? Something nascent. First question we have, I'll read it out so that everyone can hear it. It says, it sounds like we're on the verge of a new labor movement. What dimensions of this movement are particularly novel, as opposed to the labor movements of the 20th century? And what are its implications? What do you see as the relationship between blue and white collar workers? Are there opportunities to center this new movement on both/and, honoring inherent power differentials? So I wonder what any members of the panel think about that.
I can add one reflection. I think one thing that's novel is if we imagine and of course there are always exceptions to this story, but if we imagine the overall tendency in the 19th century is the concentration of workers in large workplaces. Today, what we see by contrast is often a dispersal with particular local concentrations. So if we think about something like platform delivery apps, you have a dispersal of workers, but then you have these kind of strange little concentrations in these dark kitchens, which are small kind of, kitchens which don't belong to any particular restaurant with a shop front. So you have these kind of like highly local concentrations, but also dispersals. And this presents a significant challenge to the contemporary trade union movement because workers might not know their colleagues. And this has always been one of the kind of conditions for organizing, right? You have to know who other people are. So there's a lot of interesting research on how you bring people together and set up things like worker centers and try and rebuild some of those fragmentations. And I guess you could draw an analogy with the very early parts of the beginning of the trade union movement, where often there would be kind of centres which were designed on welcoming workers who just come to that area and giving them kind of information on where you could stay, which bosses were awful, which words were who was hiring, kind of information and community centres. So I wonder if there's a lot to be learned from that history, as well as kind of concrete practices from union and workers' movements in parts of the world where that concentration via industrialization was never became was denied the kind of completion it had in the global north, particularly in Britain. So there's a lot to learn from the global south in terms of that dispersal and that atomization and overcoming that, and the tactics that might look like. So it might look like blockades of key logistics areas. But yeah, that's a limited one small comment, and I'm interested to know what others think too.
Valeria or Maro, would you want to come in on that? If not, I have another comment on this, if neither of you have something to say immediately.
Yeah, perhaps I can add also a bit to what Amelia said, and also tackling the kind of question here. Well, I think that, well, I completely agree with the issue of the fragmentation that Amelia was mentioning, and the kind of fishing workplaces. And this is anyhow a strategy also firms, companies, employers trying to fragment, the kind of collectivity. But of course, this doesn't mean that, these workers could re-collectivize. And there are a lot of examples, in what we look at also in the new emerging areas of work. If you look at the gig economy, we see that. And we see also that these workers, in most of the cases now, independently, whether independent unions or established unions, for me, to be honest, that is not the main issue. But the most important is that these workers, they find themselves, and in most of the cases, they also have a linkage with the community. The community, kind of really underpinning the capacity that workers can build upon in, kind of creating a collective that can then deliver on the side of rights and recognition of rights for them. I mean, there is interesting examples also reported very much in the academic debate about riders in the city of Bologna, for example, and the Charter of Rights that they've been able to achieve. So I think that there are certainly possibilities there. On the other hand, I mean, to me, perhaps what I would see is, and there I see still, some kind of segmentation going on, and I really don't know how to make out of it, is, think about what COVID, what have been the implication of COVID on the way how people work, and we are back into perhaps an issue of time, but also an issue of the way in which now we work, and we see a lot of these boundaries between working free time and working time blurred. A lot of people working by remote, and these were mostly white-collar workers in most of the cases, and they've been, facing the consequences also of it. But other workers who couldn't really work by remote, they had to go and work there. So you see there the kind of different scenarios that COVID really put people looking at, saying, here we have a separation. So the different conditions under which people, in most of the cases also miserable condition, particularly for those who have been, had to go and work and producing the kind of goods that we were consuming, and also care workers as well. So, these workers, they couldn't leave. So that you see there how COVID really put this scenario of divisions very much there. And then you have a fragmentation, really. Now, how can we make out of it, how this can be a center for new movement? I really don't know. But I acknowledge the fact that there are two completely different scenarios, where on the one end, I'm not saying that the white collar we're also struggling a lot. Particularly women, well, in Italy, just to give you I was, after a couple of months reading the news, when the situation went back into place after the first two waves, more than the majority of women were working before, they had to leave their own jobs, so they didn't go back to work. So that's another problem raised by, so what I want to say is there is a fragmentation that really, I don't know how to think in terms of, but certainly there is and exists, and is also social, sort of, so women working in care, a migrant working in, mid industries or in, logistics. So you have this kinds of class element, which is also quite interesting, and you see that creating segments and fragmentation still.
Orlando, if I can just jump
please
in
do,
there,
yeah.
because I think, Amelia, you mentioned like some potential strategies being discussed, and I think that the question we are being asked is a very good question. And Amelia mentioned worker centers as one of the strategies being discussed to bring dispersed workers together, be it people working remotely or people working in the gig economy, and how that can help create less precaritized, let's say, modes of living. And it just made me think, and I can just throw it in the conversation, of the idea also of open care centers that some of Amelia's and my also friends over at the Autonomy think tank that focus on work are working on, like the idea of actually having open care centers where that work of care is being communalized and visibilized, and again people can interact in a different space. And I'd really encourage people to go and check out that work, and I can put a link in the chat as well. But I just want to make also that reflection that most of these solutions are again spatial solutions. Like a lot of our imagination is about creating these spaces. And again, that doesn't always cut through the temporal inequalities I was talking about before, right? Like the people that work the night shifts, the people that cannot even relate to such a spatial politics, if you know what I mean. But I feel like the question there, A, was a very good question, and B, was saying, how do we create these spaces, be it real spaces or temporal spaces, while somehow honoring the power differentials? And I'm not sure what's a good answer to that, but I think it's a very, very, very good point.
May I just add one thing on this, Orlando? Now, more from an industrial relations perspective, I think that all the time that we also think about possible solutions, perhaps might be also interesting to think about, and I think this comes very much also in light in the book of Amelia. So what, and I've been also kind of seeing coming through in some of the section I've been, visiting in this fantastic global forum. So the shifting of risk on, certain people rather than others, and there is a power relations. So it's the shifting and it's not me who says that, shifting of risk from capital to labor, from then labor to within labor to others. Now, for example, we are doing some work, we're looking at the way how this creating precariousness as effect on the family, shifts risk on family, people doing a lot of unremunerated work, impacts directly on women, impact directly on the people who have to sustain the guy or the lady who is doing unpaid work, for example. Now, why do I say this? Because I think to me, this, at least to me, is very important in a kind of structural way, in the sense that I think it is important to regain responsibility back to capital, back to employers, back to firms, whether we like it or not. And it is a political issue, because we have to be attentive when we think about what we are putting there. Now, for example, I mean, I'm very, kind of fan of the minimum basic income, but on the other hand, we have to be aware of the fact that the basic minimum income can create even more situation for employers and firms to say, listen, guy, why should I take care of you? You have your basic income, so you do it yourself. And this is not only me who is saying this. There's a lot of debate, particularly in the area of more industrial relations, employment relations, scholars that have been debating about that, because we see that there is this shifting, and companies and capital tries to put and shift. So whatever kind of political or solution or imaginatory or experimentation we think, we need to think always also in that side. What does this mean for? And we see this particularly nowadays after COVID, firms thinking, spaces, let's cut everything, people work at home. Of course, this means, I work at home is my, oh, well, I'm flexible. Well, we have seen that this is not always the case. People struggle, particularly, women struggle. So I just wanted to say this here because I feel myself that this is an important contested area, and we do need to figure out in this, again, as comes from the book of Amelia, this power relationship. All the things we do have to be contextualized in this power relationship context, and looking at the implication that this might have from a political side, really. I just wanted to just put there. I don't know whether you might not agree about what I'm saying. Say, oh, she's completely insane. But I just, yeah.
No, thank you very much. Amelia, did you want to respond to that, or shall I? Well, I'd like to encourage everyone viewing as well to ask questions, because we only have about 7 minutes left in this session. So please do stick a question in the Q&A or comment. And thank you, Maro, for putting these things in the chat as well. So are there any questions from the audience? Yes, we have some in the Q&A. So Liz Fuchsman says, to Maro's point, it's interesting to also reflect on the way morality and the fetishization of work ethic prevents us from collectively demanding more time or less work. Do the three of you have thoughts about shifting the culture of valorizing busyness and overwork? Well, I mean, Amelia, I know you have thoughts on this and you're nodding. Would you like to say anything about that?
Sure. I think it's a really good question. I think one thing to think about is, and it relates to the point Valeria just made, which is, where do these attitudes and ethics and beliefs come from, and who do they benefit? Because I think one worry I have with the discussion of overwork is that it's somehow in some of the kind of popular discussion of it in magazines and online, you get this sense that this work ethic is sort of unmoored, or just this kind of attitude that people have. And I think one thing that I think about is how do we root it back into the workplace or into people's work relations, either present or future? And I think a lot of that sense of that urgency of time, that feeling that you're wasting your time if you're not being productive at all times, comes from this responsibilization. So it comes from the shifting downwards of risk, because you are supposed to be managing yourself to some extent in lots of jobs, right? So I think it's important that when we talk about that kind of anxious temporal orientation, right? Like that sense that you should be using your time well. Where does this come from, and how does it differ from other versions of capitalist temporality and the experience of time, I guess? And there's that great E.P. Thompson article about clock time and these kind of diatribes against people being lazy because they need to go and be using their time well. And what's interesting about that, I guess, is that it's done to actors, right? So it's a disciplinary force on the working class, done by concrete kind of individual actors, whether that's like, kind of moralists or employers, whereas now the kind of, in some sectors, the experience of time is like anxious and pressing and something you should be using well, comes from the agent themselves, right? Which is really fascinating. And I think it's important for us to think, okay, well, who is this attitude benefiting? What are its kind of material sources? In terms of shifting that culture, I think it's interesting to think about the ways in which people do it in workplaces kind of instinctively. So you have, say you work somewhere, everyone knows it really takes 10 minutes to complete a task, right? But everyone pretends that it takes half an hour because you don't want your work to be intensified. So I think there's kind of interesting things that happen almost intuitively. How we scale those is difficult. I think the pandemic did see this kind of at the beginning for some workers, this raising of consciousness about like time and the experience of anxiety and time, which was kind of interesting. I think in terms of one kind of concrete thing is building up other sites of meaning outside of work can help that in the community, and including in bits of non-wage social reproduction as well. I'll stop because I want to hear what other people think, and we don't have that much time.
No, thanks a lot, Amelia. Maro or Valeria, would you like to come back in on that question? No? Okay, well...
Sorry, I was muted. I'm sorry. Let's just very quick, there's lots to say. It's a big topic. I think Amelia kind of covered a lot of the answers I would also give to Lisa's very good questions, and definitely that fetishization of the work ethic, we see it, across like levels of inequality and income. Like everybody will have demonstrated work ethic, from the day laborer to the CEO, and the work of Amelia, Liz, and others have demonstrated that empirically as well. I feel like one of the ways to shift that culture is to move away from that time management as individual achievement. And we see that everywhere, right? We see this magazine like, how do I spend my Sundays, or various like creative people saying how do they perfectly manage their Sunday to do a lot of meaningful things. And how would that be different if it's like, not how do I manage my time, but who maintains my time, who and what relationships work to keep me in time. And I think we need to spreading more that collective understanding of time is part of undoing that personal glorification of business, etc., etc. But that's only one part of the puzzle to add in there.
Yeah, perhaps if I might just add one thing on this as well, which I agree, I would perhaps, I don't know, end with a question for us. Now we see that, as a result of COVID, the results also of, a lot of changes in the world of work, and particularly, this kind of pushing for entrepreneurship idea, which is again a big ideological word, and which he's hitting the aspect that Maro was referring to. Now I was thinking, well, if people now are pushed more and more, working more by remote, at home, teleworking, and companies and firms, they would, of course, need to control them. So they would probably control them by outputs, saying, okay, by this, you end up and you have to deliver me this, and then so my question is, how do we find a way to break this and shifting this culture that I completely agree is a perfectly sound question. So how do we make ourselves in a situation where we really are able to? So what I want to say is to problematize also the teleworking as a way of working. So teleworking without a regulation, or in fact working time, will never work. Will increase exponentially our workload, will in fact not let us shifting the culture. So, so we need also to break this, or to rethink the way how and the environment and the context in which people work. This, I think, also is quite important in order to make advancement which are, good for people, and for not only the work of people, but for the health of people and the social context in which they live.
I think that is, I think those are the right questions, right? I'm not sure any of us have the answers, right? But I think that point as well about teleworking and this creep of time is shot through in Amelia's book too, right? It's one of the most kind of present threads through it. It's just spreading out over non-work life and the ways that it does so. Okay, we are out of time. But thank you three very much. I think that was a great panel, really fascinating discussion as part of a really good global forum. So I hope everyone watching can join in some of the later sessions as well. Thank you very much for your questions. And thank you again to our three panelists. All right, thanks a lot.
Thank you.